Welcome to News from Neptune for March 6th in the 10th week of 2020. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, who was murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Yesterday was the birthday of Rosa Luxemburg in 1871. She was a revolutionary socialist of Polish-Jewish descent. She split from the Social Democrats, the SPD, in Germany when they supported World War I and co-founded the Spartacus League. She was murdered by the right-wing paramilitaries acting on behalf of the Socialist Party in the wake of the failed Spartacist uprising of 1919. The website Working Class History has made available a number of her works, and it's worth checking out. Proceeds from their activities are going to fund translations of the 75% of her writings, which is still not available in English. You can see workingclasshistory.com for this connection if you like. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of the program are available at archive.org. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. With the help of J.B. Nicholson's research, David Green and I will try to say some true things today on a, let's see if my computer can find the account. Sorry.
Technology.
Yes, indeed. The title I've given to my notes for today's program is to call the program a U.S. Biowarfare ? Program. Asia Times, which is worth keeping an eye on, a newspaper published in Asia, has what they call a jaw-dropping interview with Dr. Francis Boyle, friend of this ground, a guest on this program occasionally, in something called Geopolitics and Empire. Asia Times says, Boyle is not a crackpot. He drafted the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989 that was approved by both houses of the U.S. Congress and signed into law by former President George H.W. Bush. In the interview, Boyle gave a detailed statement alleging that the COVID-19, the coronavirus, is an offensive biological warfare weapon, and that the World Health Organization knows that that's the case. The author of Biowarfare and Terrorism, Boyle's book, Boyle also refers to a report from Great Game India that Chinese biowarfare agents working in a lab in the Canadian city of Winnipeg smuggled the coronavirus to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China, the only level 4 biosafety lab in China, from where it allegedly leaked. ZeroHedge.com, American website, dared to carry a story linking Chinese scientists to the outbreak and was immediately banned from Twitter. The social media site has confirmed that ZeroHedge was permanently banned for violating its, quote, platform manipulation policy, close quote. Interesting question of the censorship of various forms of things that are being said. But it's being suggested in some places that if it is the case, as Francis, who knows what he's talking about, insists, that COVID-19, the coronavirus, is a bioweapon, and the notion is that it has been spread around the world, beginning in China, accidentally or on purpose, as a as developed as it was as a weapon of hybrid warfare. This is the suggestion that is being made in various places. Not quite what Francis says. He simply insists that it was a bioweapon that escaped accidentally or on purpose from this Canadian connection to the Chinese lab, to Wuhan. We'll see more about that as the program goes on. What's on the top of your list today, David?
Well, I thought I'd start with something silly.
How appropriate.
Since you started with something obviously not silly. No, I just wanted to say that when I read an article in the News Gazette, I think by their editorial board, and about the current election of judges in Champaign County, or in whatever circle, whatever it is, the judges are running for, they referred to something called a bar poll. And I really honestly thought that somebody went into a bar and did a poll. I mean, I really actually thought that, Jason. I really did.
The only time I know that was done was when I ran for Congress in 2002, and Eric Sizemore, who's working in the campaign, conducted a bar poll to see how it was going.
Well, it's good to know that there was actually a real bar poll. And it took me really till the end of the article before I realized what a bar poll was, which is a poll of local lawyers.
Who may be in the bar, we don't know.
And which then the reporting on that, I mean, there's a slightly serious aspect to that. A local lawyer by the name of Diana Lennick, who I know slightly, wrote a letter to the editor saying that bar polls, like the kind where you poll lawyers, are actually worthless in terms of who participates in them and how much they know and how significant, how these people are actually polled, whether these people represent lawyers or whether the lawyers even know who's qualified to be judges. It's all a pretty silly business, but I thought I would start with that. There's a lot more silly business to be had because we're living through the age of the most extreme identitarian politics that I've witnessed, not only in my lifetime, Carl, but even in your lifetime.
I think you may be right.
You don't know where to start. You really do not know where to start with this. But let's start with a woman named Lisa Lehrer, who writes for the New York Times, who after Elizabeth Warren dropped out of the race, wrote the following. And she's a reporter. She's not a editorialist.
Hard to tell the difference.
Was it always going to be the last men standing? Was it always going to be the last man standing? And the subtitle for Elizabeth Warren, the historic number of women in the 2020 field and the Democrats who supported them, the question will linger. In the end, the pink wave carried two white men ashore. And the text goes like this. Let me see if I could skip part of this. For the first time in history, Americans saw a diverse group of female leaders pursuing the country's highest office, an elite sorority that included former prosecutors, senators, a combat veteran, and even a self-help celebrity. Notice that the combat veteran was not treated particularly gently by the New York Times, meaning, of course, Tulsi Gabbard. To go on. And for the first time in history, a majority of Democratic voters rejected them all. As the party moves toward picking a nominee, the last man left standing will be most certainly a man. It's a situation that has left some prominent Democratic women frustrated to still be fighting battles they hoped had been settled years ago. I'm not sure what the battles were settled years ago, and women are now in the political system, and they lost for good reasons or bad. The narrative, quote, okay, here's quoting Representative Barbara Lee, who used to be a kind of a good guy on the anti-war side of things, and maybe still is. She said, the narrative that somehow women are less electable than men seems to still be an issue. It's very disgusting, really, Representative Lee said, who was one of Senator Kamala Harris's campaign co-chairs. Another strike against Barbara Lee. Also, by the way, Maxine Waters, another prominent black congresswoman, has also been horrible lately, or probably for quite some time. In 2020, Lee continued, in 2020, we should have a woman as our commander-in-chief. How do you say that? How do you say that in this is me talking, how do you say that in 2020 we should have a woman as our commander-in-chief?
It's their turn.
Why should we have anyone, and why should it be a woman, barring knowing what that woman stands for? Lisa Lehrer goes on, that's a view shared by many of the female candidates, who struggle to explain how, after the year of the woman, no women remained as a serious contender for the nomination. And now she's going to quote Elizabeth Warren. Warren says, one of the hardest parts of this, her voice shaking as she announced the end of her campaign on Thursday, is all those little girls who are going to have to wait 4 more years. That's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. In what way? I mean, little girls who are privileged, it's not going to be hard. Little girls who are much less privileged, life is hard for reasons which doesn't have to be the case, and for reasons which Senator Warren didn't really have any programs for. For example, you could look up on Matt Brunig's People's Policy Project website, you could look up a comparison of the early childhood programs of Bernie Sanders and Warren. Warren's was typical. This is me talking here. It was means tested. That's Liz means testing Warren. Never universal programs. Never universal free programs. You don't want to give rich people stuff. You want to use rich people. You want to use your claim to not give rich people stuff as a way of depriving poor people of stuff. Sanders had a universal, non-means tested program. This was also, by the way, mentioned by Sundiata Shajua in his last News Gazette column as a way of supporting, as a way of oh no, actually, maybe it was the previous one before that I wrote a letter about, which should appear in the newspaper any day now. Anyway, to go on with Lisa Lehrer, Senator Amy Klobuchar described feeling a kind of obligation, quote unquote, to the girls who would approach her at events. Quote, this is how I reconcile some of the fact that I'm not up there anymore. It's that you also see women with power. She said in an interview Wednesday night, quote, they ended up by not choosing the women, but that doesn't mean the women are going to go away. Who's saying they are? The question is, who are the women? A prosecutor like Amy Klobuchar, another prosecutor like Kamala Harris, a corporate Democrat like Liz Warren, that's what she is. Quote, more Klobuchar. No, I'm done quoting Klobuchar. I'm going to quote Kamala Harris here, as it does in the article. The reality is that there's still a lot of work to be done to make it clear that women are exceptionally qualified and capable of being, I mean, just listen, if you actually think about this sentence, women are exceptionally qualified and capable of being the commander-in-chief of the United States, she told reporters on Capitol Hill on Thursday. What does it mean to say that women are exceptionally qualified? Would somebody say that men are exceptionally qualified? Would someone say that gay people are exceptionally qualified? It doesn't mean anything. If it means anything, it doesn't mean anything. If it means something, then I'm worried. Then I'm worried about what it actually does mean. So Lisa Lear finishes her article. 12 candidates were on stage for the October Democratic debate. For the first time in history, Americans saw numerous high-profile female politicians running for president. As the campaign moved across the country, the debate over that simple and strangely enduring question, can a woman win, which you could also ask, like, can a social democrat win? Can a populist win? Well, Donald Trump kind of proved that, although we have differences about populism, but that's neither here nor there right now. Strangely enduring question, can a woman win, happened in book clubs and college dorm rooms. That's the only places where people talk about stuff like this. On debate stages and at town hall meetings. For supporters of Ms. Harris, the question included asking about the greater challenges black women face. After Ms. Warren announced her bid at the end of 2018, Democratic strategists fretted over whether the misogyny they argued helped cause Hillary Clinton's defeat in 2016. But of course, nobody's ever proved that misogyny caused her defeat in 2016. Could take down another woman nominee. Early comparisons to Mrs. Clinton were unavoidable for the women running in 2020, even though they had little in common other than their gender and their party. And in fact, they had a lot in common with Hillary Clinton because they were all running as corporate Democrats, except Tulsi Gabbard to a certain extent. The language, the kind of slippery language, the kind of identitarian assumptions that go in an article like this, and also in an article like Michelle Goldberg had a similar article in the New York Times, and also the assumptions that Leonard Pitts, a gay black man, had in his column, harshly critical of Bernie Sanders for the wrong reasons. I don't know where to start, but let me just say one more thing, Carl. Sure. You know, Rebecca Solnit, also the feminist writer, also had a column in the New York Times about violence against women and so forth, and silencing of women, which is what she writes about. And she wrote this a little out of context, but just one paragraph. She's referring to stories about violence against women. Most of these stories don't make the news at all. Other times the news is saturated with them. The other day, Mr. Trump, Julian Assange, this was subsequent to the conviction of Harvey Weinstein, okay? The other day, Mr. Trump, Julian Assange, Mr. Weinstein, the Jeffrey Epstein backer and Victoria's Secret owner Leslie Wexner, and Michael Bloomberg, he of the multiple non-disclosure agreements, were all on the front page of a leading newspaper, along with the German mass shooter who'd also murdered his mother. Nothing indicated that most of these figures and some of these stories were all about the same thing: gender violence and gendered silence. Notice the way she slips the name of Julian Assange into there.
The Assange matter is very badly covered in this country for obvious reasons. The U.S. government is convinced that it has to destroy the ability of the press to report American war crimes, and by making an example of Julian Assange, and they look like doing pretty well on that in that regard. And Assange has been imprisoned and tortured, according to the UN, as a result of the American campaign. The British courts, remarkably biased in the accounts that we've gotten from the trial, are deciding whether Assange will be sent to the U.S. To be imprisoned for publishing accounts of what the U.S. is doing. Yes, I know you thought there was a First Amendment, but don't let that go to your head. It's not really very serious. an example of the sort of publication, the sort of press, in a sense, that we get in this country comes from a strange but not unfamiliar source, that is Hillary Clinton. Jeff Nicholson, our researcher, points out that the Jimmy Dore show and others have taken up Hillary Clinton's new podcast. You didn't know that Hillary Clinton was making podcasts available, but she has her ear to the ground, as we know, and has noted the enthusiasm for podcasts across the country, and so she's got one too, or not just one, a good number. The project, the Clinton podcast project, is guided by the spirit of Clinton's recent media blitz. The Stern podcast, a recent podcast with David Plouffe, in which she suggested that Tulsi Gabbard was being groomed by the Russians, and an interview with The Hollywood Reporter to promote a new Hulu documentary series in which she says of Bernie Sanders, quote, "Nobody likes him, nobody wants to work with him, he got nothing done," close quote. This is news from Mrs. Clinton. Hillary Clinton wants the main guests on her podcast.
She got a lot done. She wrecked a whole country.
Well, I don't know whether she can get all the credit, but she certainly
of
contributed.
Course. Yes, yes.
Hillary Clinton wants, we're talking about wrecking a whole
country. Who
country.
says women can't do stuff like that?
Well, there we are. We're talking about all the dead people in Libya that are responsive, for which Mrs. Clinton was responsible. Hillary Clinton wants the main guests on her podcast to be defined by the theme of her most recent book. Person close to her described the ideal interview for the show as, quote, "a meeting of the minds with people of grit and determination," close quote. Whom could they be referring to? But still. Twitter replies include Jimmy Dore's, "I blame Russia." That's how come Hillary has a podcast. Ron Placone says each episode will have a public link and a private one.
I'm not sure if I got that joke, but the public and private.
It was her public comments on politics and her private connections to the banks.
Oh, I see. Okay.
She had a public,
Okay.
a public account and a private account.
I see.
Okay. Or story, so a public story and a private story. One for the leaders of the American banks who don't have to take what she says publicly very quickly, very seriously, because they have a private account of what she really means and what she really would do. Donovan Hamilton says the first episode of Hillary's podcast has 500 streams before it even airs. The second episode will consist of HRC blaming everyone for the failure of her podcast. Another comment, episode 1, it's Russia's fault. Episode 2, it's sexism's fault. Episode 3, it's Bernie's fault. Episode 4, it's WikiLeaks' fault. So there you have the summary of Hillary's podcast. A couple of suggested titles. I've fallen and I can't shut up. Another suggested title for Hillary's podcast, A Hug and a Kissinger. She actually produced a 2016 promotional podcast entitled With Her. There was also a podcast from the Clinton Foundation, Why Am I Telling You This? So help me, that's what they call it. So there you go. If you can't get enough Clinton family propaganda now, you have something to tide you over until the next dose or until Chelsea gets older. Jeff Nicholson says, why the Quotes Around the World podcast? I see no point in branding my language with advertisements for a device and company I don't want to help, a tie that's possible to old tech, or to promote a device that assists DRM. This is
oh, Jeff, I love it when you talk tech.
Well, he talks tech, and he also talks the fact that a lot of people are talking tech. Podcasts, I'm astonished at how effective podcasts seem to be in providing another level of communication, at least as corrupt as the ones that exist right now, and the way in which the First Amendment is gotten around is by pointing out that all of these things are being done by commercial enterprises, not by the government, and therefore the commercial enterprises have no responsibility to be, quote, fair and balanced, as we used to say about public broadcasting.
Yeah, so they haven't really figured out how to control the Patreon website that provides a source of funding for a lot of these, and they're just in it for money, of course. I mean, it's just a tech startup, but they're doing it. Works. It works for for me. Those podcasters that want to give their stuff away for free, they're not really relying on Patreon. There's several other websites that these appear on, or on iTunes, or on something called Libsys and something called Stitcher, and so on and so forth. But the people who want to get a little money out of it and have subscribers, like the What's Left podcast that I'm always touting on this show, and that I will continue to tout on this show, do a pretty good job. And so you have a podcast like What's Left that requires the people who subscribe to it to pay at least $5, and they get about a little less than 400 subscribers, which means they get 2,000 per month, which probably most of which goes to actually the cost of making the program, of hiring someone to buy the stuff and work the stuff so that it sounds good.
More than we get for this show, right?
Right, a lot more. But in passing, let me just highlight. I meant to sort of drop in a shout out to our old friend Doug Henwood, who's been doing a remarkable job lately of having the kind of interviewees and topics that aren't necessarily found all over the place in the podcast world, although some are. His last few programs have all been very good, I find, even though it doesn't always sound to me like this topic, this person or this topic is really gonna compel me. It usually does. One of his recent interviews, maybe 3 weeks ago, is with a fellow named Yasha Levine, who he's interviewed a few times over the years, and it's about Ukraine, and it's about the relationship, which I knew about, but maybe not quite to this extent. This woman, Chrystia Freeland, this woman who's a minister in Canada, or a high official in Canada of some kind, and her background, her lineage of Ukrainian Nazis. And I knew about this, but he put it in very concise and specific terms that in this 25-minute interview that I found very informative. So, and let me just read one more quote here relevant to what you just said, Carl.
Okay.
In the New York Times. And there's more to this, but the New York Times is spending a lot of energy digging up trash on Bernie Sanders dealing with Russia in the 1980s, for crying out loud. And the blurb here is, "Go deeper. Documents uncovered by the Times reveal details about Mr. Sanders' efforts to establish ties with the Soviet Union when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont in the 1980s. The documents also show how the Kremlin hoped to use the relationship to its advantage. In a statement, his campaign said Mr. Sanders was proud, quote unquote, of his grassroots diplomatic efforts." So this was an effort of his to have a second city or sister city type relationship with Russia in the context of the former Soviet Union, the Gorbachev Soviet Union, the Gorbachev that Ronald Reagan was talking to all the time,
right,
and actually in their clumsy way ended the Cold War, began the end of the Cold War. Meanwhile, Bernie Sanders, over 30 years later, is being criticized as a candidate for doing that. Just, of course, he's also being more harshly criticized for opposing the Contras in Nicaragua and that kind of thing. Again, you just can't believe this. You
really
you
can't.
just can't believe it.
It's really, I mean, the ghost of Joe McCarthy stalks the land, and I really don't, having heard it the first time, I don't believe it the second time, and it's just astonishing. I mean, and this is not limited to, anti-Sanders paranoia on the grounds that Sanders has a shot at the Democratic nomination. Remember, it was Tulsi Gabbard, whom Hillary Clinton said was probably a Russian asset, and whose job was to foul up the elections. I mean, this is incredible stuff that suggests the lengths to which the political establishment will go to try to censor Facebook, Twitter, the internet in general, which it can't control quite the same way it controls newspaper journalism and radio and TV. It's an incredible situation, and one that is ongoing. It isn't stopping. Tulsi Gabbard, the only anti-war candidate for the Democratic nomination, sued Google because Google, which of course is is a private corporation, not a government agency, said Google violated her First Amendment rights, said Tulsi, by temporarily shutting down her advertising account and also funneling some of her campaign emails to spam in Gmail. Well, the answer to that, of course, was that Google is not bound by the First Amendment. Google can't violate the First Amendment because the First Amendment controls what the government does, and Google, of course, is not the government, in spite of what you may have heard. And the suit was thrown out, but she was on to something that was happening, that is the censorship of the presidential campaign discussions on to acceptable limits, those acceptable limits not including an anti-war position, which Gabbard was the sole representative of in that group. So, the attempt to try to use the courts to make sure that the media system was fair and balanced was going to come to naught, and has been thrown out now by a judge. But the issue that it points out is the extent to which censorship in this country is very easily accomplished in regard to someone like Gabbard and to an anti-war candidate, and that's no problem, even though we think that we have a constitutional protection for free speech. We don't.
And let me add one more thing. Speaking of freedom of speech, I referred before to a column that appeared in the News Gazette from Leonard Pitts, who writes for the Atlanta Constitution, an editorialist. It was titled "The Swarming Behavior of Bernie Sanders Voters." Let me just read one paragraph here.
Okay.
Well, maybe more than one paragraph. And it brings in film director Ava DuVernay, the woman who produced the movie about Martin Luther King, and who is, I'm sorry to say, just a typical black PMC, sort of like the woman Nicole Hannah-Jones, who did the 1619 Project. These are very sheltered and hyper entitled African American women, I'm sorry to say, who shouldn't be representing other African American women as they pretend to do. But Leonard Pitts writes about this. You'd have thought she had thrown Bernie Sanders to his death from a tower of $1 million bills. Actually, what film director Ava DuVernay tweeted Saturday, that presumably is a couple weeks ago, was just a mild rebuke. Quote, "I'm undecided," that is undecided between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders and whomever. "I'm undecided, but I know this isn't what I want," meaning I don't want to have to choose between Bernie Sanders and blah, blah, blah. She was I don't want to have to choose between white men. She was responding to Sanders' tweet warning the Democratic and Republican establishments that, quote, they can't stop us. That's what Sanders was saying before this past Tuesday. I assume he's not saying that now, but that's a different story. I don't know if you have any comments about that. But anyway, Leonard Pitts writes, in response to her response, a digital mob numbering in the thousands descended upon Duvernay. Many contented themselves with noting how surprised, quote unquote, and disappointed, quote unquote, they were at her failure to appreciate the senator's wonderfulness. Pitts is being sarcastic about Bernie Sanders. Others went below and beyond, calling her blah, 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 and more insulting right-winger. There were isolated death threats. Not really death threats, just the kind of crap people say on Twitter. And Pitts writes, it was just the latest example of the swarming behavior that in many minds characterizes Sanders' voters. Not that any candidate has a monopoly on overheated or bullying supporters, but as many observers have pointed out, his people will have to do, quote unquote, because he doesn't have any evidence, because to my knowledge, empirical evidence has yet to be compiled, Pitts writes, more likely to descend angrily and en masse when he is attacked or even questioned. Some people describe it as a digital lynch mob. This is the kind of tactics we have from basically black conservatives. And it's not the least bit surprising that Ava DuVernay, in her context, in her role, in her kind of, in her role that doesn't challenge Obama, that is perfectly consistent with people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, and so on and so forth. It's not the least bit surprising that someone like her or someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones and the whole 1619 Project business, it's not the least bit surprising that they don't want to support Bernie Sanders, because the question becomes not, can you support a woman? Can you love on black people? The question becomes, as Adolph Reed would put it, can you vote for a social democrat who has programs that obviously, given the class nature of African American life in this country, can you vote for someone whose programs, if they were put into place, would obviously disproportionately benefit African American people? Those are the kind of questions we ought to be asking, not what's wrong with, all this lurid nonsense. Shocking, even though I've never liked Leonard Pitts. I always thought he was just sort of a trivial liberal, kind of a trivial Obama liberal. The News Gazette chooses to publish him so they can say they published a black man. They choose to publish Sundiata Shajua, who wonders whether he could support Sanders because Sanders doesn't support reparations for African American people. And I perfectly understand, and people like Adolph Reed also don't support that. And so maybe Sundiata ought to be asking why that is, and also why it's a losing electoral strategy to do that. All these questions are just hanging out there, but apparently if you talk a certain way, these people who are claiming that they're being silenced are the ones silencing other people. It's clear, that's obvious from their substance and from their tone.
One of the best places, I think, to read about these issues in a serious fashion rather than in the ideologized and indeed ignorant way in which they're normally being discussed is Black Agenda Report, which covers a good bit of these matters. And I remember their editor referring to one black accommodationist author, I think it was Ta-Nehisi Coates, as suddenly speaking up for reparations in order to get his race card punched.
Yes, exactly.
I think that's what happens when we hear examples like this. And And it's a shame. There are a lot of voices there that are silenced. One important one is Bruce Dixon, whose voice is silenced by death, unfortunately. He was an extremely thoughtful member of the Georgia Green Party who talked about the ways in which the Green Party should be a social democratic party and taking up these issues of race in a non-race card punched way, so to speak. That came to mind particularly this last week or two because of a dispute an identitarian dispute in the Georgia Green Party. The Georgia Green Party, as an organization, adopted a resolution that offended the trans community. And they've been very strongly, they were defending women's spaces and things of that sort. And the outraged trans community and their sympathizers have gone after the Green Party for that reason. And the Green Party is now embroiled, the Georgia Green Party, the Green Party as a whole is now embroiled in a dispute which takes them far away from their real concerns as a social democratic party into a identity politics a black hole, and that is unfortunate to see. And Bruce Dixon would have been one of the first to condemn, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me just drop in a note here, again referring to Doug Henwood. He did an interview with Margaret Kimberly, one of the Black Agenda Report writers, who's written a book about the presidents, the history of the presidents of this country, in relation not just to race, but primarily to race, but to other issues. I'm not necessarily all that fond of narrowing history down to talking about presidents, but she gave a very informative and engaging interview with Doug Henwood about going surveying from George Washington moving forward, and it's a kind of a fun romp.
Other things we might recommend. Our friend Jeffrey Sinclair at Counterpunch has quite a remarkable column today about a concentration camp that he visited, a concentration camp that the U.S. ran during the Second World War, and that is a reflection both on what the federal government was doing at the time and evokes parallels to the last president of the United States, referred to as the deporter-in-chief, and to the immigration outrages conducted under the current president of the United States. Jeffrey's column, as usual, is well-informed. It talks about material you haven't heard about, probably. I hadn't, and I recommend it highly. Really should be looked at. That's on the Counterpunch website.
Let me criticize a white person for a change.
For a while.
Just I had to drop this in there. These are actually from my notes for last week when we didn't end up doing a program. The News Gazette has a go-to local political scientist named Brian Gaines, and in the process of doing his usual horse race, sort of silly horse race stuff about the campaigns and so forth, Brian felt like he just had to drop in a note that Bernie Sanders has to deal with this issue of being attracted to authoritarian leaders. And of course, I mean, I've talked a little bit with Brian about this in the past. He was very critical of Hugo Chavez and so forth. But this idea that people are going to be persuaded by that Bernie Sanders kind of has an affinity. He's referring now to other things, and that's what the New York Times is trying to do. Brian, you're already silly enough. You don't have to be any more silly, okay? And you're already rich enough, and you don't have to kowtow to the Hoover Institution any more than you already do.
I want to go back now to the question we started with tonight, and that was the COVID-19 virus and its political provenance. Where did it come from, and what are the political interests involved in the pandemic that's resulted from it. I refer particularly to a column by Pepe Escobar entitled American Hybrid War on China. Pepe puts the issue in the context of the ongoing foreign policy of the United States, which after all is really what we're arguing about here. Indeed, it's what made Mr. Trump president, and it is the reason he has been so viciously attacked by the American political establishment, their fear that Trump will abandon the wars and war provocations against Russia and China that are considered to be the basis of the American 1%'s dominance of the world economy. Hybrid war is the term that's been used in recent years that includes actual shooting war, economic pressures, political machinations, encouraged coups like the Obama administration's coup in Ukraine, and the mass of materials, the mass of activities that most all of them not only immoral but absolutely illegal, in which one empire, one country, one economic agglomeration tries to destroy others. Hybrid war on China is the subject that Pepe Escobar is talking about, and he connects it with these reflections and indeed fears about the coronavirus pandemic. He writes, the New Silk Roads, that is the Belt and Road Initiative, the attempt to make the connections around the world of the world economy, to the world economy by China, were launched by President Xi Jinping in 2013, first in Central Asia and then in Southeast Asia. 1 year later, the Chinese economy overtook the U.S. on a purchasing power parity. That's economists argue about how you compare economies, but roughly that means that what the Chinese economy produced, what it could buy, outstripped what the American economy produced.
As opposed to just what the exchange value is of their money, which doesn't necessarily get at what they could actually buy.
In 2014, the Chinese economy overtook the U.S. in purchasing power on a purchasing power parity basis. Inexorably, year after year since the start of the millennium, the U.S. share of the global economy shrinks while China's increases. That's what we've been living with for 2 decades. China is already the key hub of the global economy and the leading trade partner of nearly 130 nations. There may be 190-some nations in the world, depending on how you count. While the U.S. economy is hollowed out and the casino financing of the U.S. government, repo markets and all, reads as a dystopian nightmare, the civilization state steps ahead in myriad areas of technological research, not least because of Made in China 2025. That is the program, the long-term economic program of the Chinese government. China largely beats the U.S. on patent filings and produces at least 8 times as many STEM graduates a year as the U.S., earning the status of top contributor to global science. A vast array of nations across the global south signed on to be part of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, this economic coordination that China is promoting, and it's planned to be complete by the middle of the century. Last year alone, Chinese companies signed contracts worth up to $128 billion in large-scale infrastructure projects in dozens of nations. The only economic competitor to the U.S. is busy reconnecting most of the world to a 21st century, fully networked version of a trade system that was at its peak for over a millennia, the Eurasian Silk Roads. That was the medieval world economy knit together by the trade routes across Asia, which to some extent China presided over. The Belt and Road Initiative, in other words, today is supposed to be a modern version of those connections, and that's the conscious and announced program of the Chinese government. Inevitably, this state of things is something interlocking sectors of the U.S. ruling class simply would not accept. As the usual suspects fret over the stability of the Chinese Communist Party, that is, the American academics, and the Xi Jinping administration, the fact is the Beijing leadership has had to deal with an accumulation of extremely severe issues. A swine flu epidemic killing half the stock. A friend of this ground is an expert on that, an American living in China, and we've been hearing accounts occasionally from him about it. The Trump concocted trade war, Huawei accused of racketeering and about to be prevented from buying U.S.-made chips, bird flu, coronavirus virtually shutting down half of China. Add to it the incessant United States government hybrid war propaganda barrage, trespassed by acute xenophobia. Everyone from sociopathic officials to self-titled counselors are either advising corporate businesses to divert global supply chains out of China or concocting outright calls for regime change, with every possible demonization in between. The Uyghur situation in northwest China has been a godsend to people who are taking this line. There are no holds barred in the all-out offensive to kick the Chinese government while it's down in the U.S. A Pentagon cipher at the Munich Security Conference once again declares China as the greatest threat economically and militarily to the U.S., and by extension to the West, forcing a wobbly EU already subordinated to NATO to be subservient to Washington on this remixed Cold War 2.0. And this Cold War, of course, the opponent is not Russia, is Russia, of course, but is not Russia primarily, but China primarily. The whole U.S. corporate media complex repeats to exhaustion that Beijing is lying and losing control. Descending to sub-gutter racist levels, hacks even accuse the BR itself of being a pandemic, with China impossible to quarantine. Interesting use of language here for the trade policy of China. All that is quite rich, to say the least, oozing from lavishly rewarded slaves of an unscrupulous, monopolistic, extractive, destructive, depraved, lawless oligarchy, which uses, guess who he's talking about, which uses debt offensively to boost their unlimited wealth and power, while the lowly U.S. and global masses use debt defensively to barely survive. As Thomas Piketty has conclusively shown, inequality always relies on ideology. We're deep into a vicious intel war. From the point of view of Chinese intelligence, the current toxic cocktail simply cannot be attributed to just a random series of coincidences. Beijing has serial motives to piece this extraordinary chain of events as part of a coordinated hybrid war, full-spectrum dominance attack on China. Enter the dragon killer working hypothesis, a bioweapon attack capable of causing immense economic damage, but protected by plausible deniability. The only possible move by the indispensable nation, that's us, on the new great game chessboard, considering that the U.S. cannot win a conventional war on China and cannot win a nuclear war on China. So, a biological warfare weapon? On the surface, coronavirus is a dream bioweapon for those fixated on wreaking havoc across China and praying for regime change. Yet it's complicated. This report is a decent effort trying to track the origins of coronavirus. Now compare it with the insights by Dr. Francis Boyle, international law professor at the University of Illinois and author, among others, of Biowarfare and Terrorism. He's the man who drafted the U.S. Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, signed into law by George H.W. Bush. Dr. Boyle, Francis to us, is convinced coronavirus is a, quote, offensive biological warfare weapon that leapt out of the Wuhan BS4 laboratory, though he's, quote, not saying it was done deliberately. Dr. Boyle adds, quote, all these BSL-4 labs by United States, Europe, Russia, China, and Israel are all there to research, develop, and test biological warfare agents. there's really no legitimate scientific reason to have BSL-4 labs. His own research led to a whopping $100 billion by 2015 spent by the United States government on biowarfare research. Quote, "We have well over 13,000 alleged life science scientists testing biological weapons here in the United States. Actually, this goes back and it even precedes 9/11, close quote. Dr. Boyle directly accuses the Chinese government under Xi and his comrades of a cover-up from the get-go. The first reported case was December 1st, so they've been sitting on this until they couldn't anymore, and everything they're telling you is a lie. It's propaganda," close quote. The World Health Organization, for Dr. Boyle, is also on it. Quote, "They've approved many of these BSL-4 labs, can't trust anything the WHO says because they're all bought and paid for by Big Pharma, and they work in cahoots with the CDC, which is the United States government. They work in cahoots with Fort Detrick. Fort Detrick, now a cutting-edge biowarfare lab, previously was a notorious CIA den of mind control experiments. Relying on decades of research in biowarfare, the U.S. deep state is totally familiar with all bioweapon overtones. From Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki to Korea, Vietnam, and Fallujah, the historical record shows the United States government does not blink when it comes to unleashing weapons of mass destruction on innocent civilians. For its part, the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, it's called DARPA, has spent a fortune researching bats, coronaviruses, and gene-editing bioweapons. Now, conveniently, as if this was a form of divine intervention, DARPA's strategic allies have been chosen to develop a genetic vaccine. The 1996 Neocon Bible, The Project for a New American Century, unambiguously stated, quote, "Advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes, races, may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. There's no question coronavirus so far has been a heaven-sent politically useful tool, reaching with minimum investment the desired targets of maximized U.S. global power, even if fleetingly enhanced by a nonstop propaganda offensive and China relatively isolated with its economy semi-paralyzed. Yet perspective is in order. The CDC estimated up to 43 million people got sick during the 2018-19 flu season in the U.S. No less than 650,000 people were hospitalized and 62,000 died. This report details the Chinese people's war against coronavirus. It's up to Chinese virologists to decode its arguably synthetic origin. How China reacts, depending on the findings, will have earth-shattering consequences, literally. After managing to reroute trade supply chains across Eurasia in its own advantage and hollow out the heartland, American elites are now staring into void, and the void is staring back. A West ruled by the U.S. is now faced with irrelevance. BRI is the process of reversing at least 2 centuries of Western dominance. The suggestion that the coronavirus is an engineered bioweapon that escaped accidentally or on purpose from an American or Chinese bioweapons lab is consistent with the understanding that it serves the purposes of the fundamental purposes of American foreign policy, which is to retard the economic development of Eurasia. Was it an American plot? No one has said that in so many words because they don't have proof of that, but the possibility certainly exists. And we may be facing a worldwide pandemic that is part of American political strategy against Eurasia. I hope not. You've been watching News from Neptune. Carl Estabrook and David Green, along with Jeff Nicholson, produce this weekly. See the further notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we will be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.